Hey everybody, welcome to Mighty Blazes Celebrity Conversations. Today with our first ever poet pairing. We have two wonderful poets with us today. We have Leila Chatti and we have Allison Adair. Welcome to you both. So excited to have you be our inaugural poets. Oh, that's something different. That's like an inauguration poet, but you're our inaugural poet. So we're psyched to have you both. Welcome. I'm going to do quick intros of both of you, and then I'm going to turn it over to you. I think we're going to hear you both read a little bit, and then we're going to have some conversation. Those of you who are watching out there in Facebook land, if you have questions or comments, please feel free to throw them in the comment thread. And if we have time for questions, we will try to get to them. So, all right. Leila, we'll start with you. Leila Chatti was born in Oakland, California, a Tunisian-American dual citizen. She has lived in the United States, Tunisia, and southern France. She is the author of the debut full-length collection, Deluge, which she's going to hold up for us. Yes, you can't see, but oh, we have double versions there. Nice. And the chapbooks Ebb and Tunisia Amrikia. Tunisia Amrikia. Tunisia Amrikia. That's right. The 2017 editor's selection from Bull City Press. Leila's poems have received prizes from Plowshares Emerging Writers Contest, Narratives 30 Below Contest, the Gregory O'Donoghue International Poetry Prize, and the Pushcart Prize, among others, and have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, the Academy of American Poets Poem a Day, Plowshares Tin House, American Poetry Review, Virginia Quarterly Review, and many other journals and anthologies. Of Deluge, Publishers Weekly writes, in a starred review, Chatti turns fear and shame into empowerment in her unflinching debut. She translates a gritty, traumatizing experience into hypnotic, transcendental topography of the human spirit. Leila serves as the consulting poetry editor at the Raleigh Review and lives in Cincinnati, Ohio, where she is pursuing a PhD in creative writing at the University of Cincinnati as a provost fellow. Welcome, Leila.
Thank you.
I'm so sorry I butchered the name of your chapbook.
You're totally fine.
I wrote down this weird, like, phonetic pronunciation, and it just totally threw me off. What can I say? All right, Allison Adair. Allison, who I call Allie. So I know I'm just going to call you Allie at some point. I hope that's okay.
That's fine. That's fine.
Allison Adair's poems have appeared in American Poetry Review, Arts and Letters, Best American Poetry, Kenyon Review Online, and Ziziva. And her work has been honored with the Pushcart Prize, the Florida Review Editors Award, the Orlando Prize, a Mass Cultural Council grant, and first place in the Fine Line competition from Mid-American Review. Allie's first collection, The Clearing, cue to hold up the book. There we go. Yes, nice. Was selected by Henry Cole, or is it Henri Cole?
Henri.
Okay, see, all right. It was selected by Henri Cole as winner of Milkweed's Max Ridfo Poetry Prize. Cole called it a lush, lyrical book about a world where women are meant to carry things to safety and men leave decisively. Out of dry farming soil come these wise, mineral-like poems about young motherhood, mining disasters, miscarriages, memory, and much more. Allison Adair's poems are haunting and dirt-caked, but there is also a tense beauty everywhere. And the Boston Globe calls the book a dark and bodily nod to folk and fairy tale energy. I love reading reviews of poetry books because they're like poetry themselves. A bodily nod. That's like awesome. I'm going to dork out because I'm not a poet, so forgive me.
You know, that was Nina Mclaughlin, who's...
Oh, really? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Well, there we go.
Whom I hadn't met before she wrote that review. And then we started, and I was like, oh, thank you so much. So she's another local writer.
Yes, she is. In fact, I had her in a class I taught. So way back when. Originally from Central Pennsylvania, Allison teaches at Boston College in Grub Street. So welcome, Ellie, and congrats on your book. Congrats to both of you on your recent books. So very excited to have you here. All right,
Thank you. Super excited to be here.
Sure. I'm so glad you made it. Oh no, Allie, you're turning glitchy. Hopefully your connection will improve. Poof.
Oh no,
Oh,
Oh, no.
back. It worked. I think
It worked. Yeah, my poof, my
I'm here.
here. Okay.
You guys hear me? I
Yeah,
was trying to be still.
yeah.
Oh, that's scary.
That
So
always
far,
works.
I'm looking at the modem. Everything looks good. Everything is on.
Okay. All right. We'll just assume that that was just a little thing and it's not going to happen again. So, all right, I will turn it over to you guys because I think you know what you're going to do.
Thank you so much for having us, Jane, and shout out to Jenna Bloom too for inviting us as the. And I'll take inaugural poets.
Yeah, inaugural poet.
I'll take an inauguration first, and then I'll take inaugural poets.
Yes.
And thanks to Leila too for being up for doing this. Which
Thank you, Allison.
talking before we started about how we've been sort of like following each other's publications and stuff for a few years now. So it's really fun to like dish about the actual books now that they're out. So,
They're out. It's just like very exciting. There they are.
I know, it's like a real physical thing. It's so exciting. So I know that, usually with prose readers, there's too much heft to the material to do a bunch of reading, but Leila and I were thinking that it might be fun to start with some poems, and we actually picked poems of each other's. And Leila, I wondered if you would be reading, or if you want me to read, Mary in the Waiting Room at the Gynecologist's Office, which I think frames the book so beautifully, and I feel like I can really hear your voice in it and the voice of the book.
I would gladly read that for you. I'm also excited to read that poem because it's one of the earliest ones that I wrote for the book. I wrote it when I was a graduate student during my master's. So for me, it's like a very old friend, it feels like. Yeah. Mary in the Waiting Room at the Gynecologist's Office. She flips the silken page of a Cosmo and sucks on her teeth. I watch her immaculate hands as she scans sex tips and checks again her phone. Her veil hangs loosely, ornaments her shoulders like a fresh drift of snow. It's just us two. Across the room, a water cooler gurgles beneath framed diagrams nailed to the wall. Uterus, fallopian tubes, a vagina opening its deep, throated rose. Mary presses her palm to the heat of her breast, turns to me and says, as if apologizing, "I'm a little nervous." Carefully, she smooths her blue skirt, glances at the ceiling, whispers, "One was enough." In my hand, an empty cup. Mary crosses her legs, fingers a slender chain around her neck. She rubs her thumb against the pendant's tiny face, his miniature arms permanently splayed. And yeah, is there another one you want me to read? I could read another one.
Well, first I was wondering if you maybe would just tell us a little bit about the book and how it came to be conceived, and sort of how Mary became a part of a thread of pretty personal stories that are told in the book.
Yeah, absolutely. So this book is about a period of that began in my early 20s. And it happened around the same time that I was in graduate school. So I had an illness and a series of tumors that were believed to be cancer. And I first became aware of them when I was 22. And then I started graduate school right afterward. So the entirety of my MFA experience would be me going to workshop, then me heading to the hospital for tests and things, and then coming back and writing poems to bring to workshop, to bring to class. So really the book began not as a book, just as me writing to learn how to write and writing to make sense of what was happening. I didn't think I would write a book about it. I thought that books had to be about serious things, and somehow the serious thing that I was living was too female to be serious. And I'd been told that explicitly by some people in positions of power. So I was writing these poems, but I thought nothing would ever come of them. And so like that poem in particular, it was in my graduate thesis, and it was one that I cared about, but I didn't know that it was going to be part of a larger narrative. And So I didn't know when I was writing these early poems. I'm kind of laughing to myself because there's a number of poems about Mary in my thesis, which was not the beginning of the book. It was random poems, but there are a number that are about Mary. Was because I was so interested in her as a figure, as someone who's been raised in deep faith. I'm Muslim, and my father's Muslim, my mother's Catholic. Mary was this one figure, this one female source of divinity, I guess, that existed between the two and that had real power. And she was really the only female figure in faith for me that I could see that had power, some power and respect. And when I was sick, I was really interested in looking for a female source of comfort and power to appeal to. And Mary was that figure. And then I started to realize, though, when I was sort of casting my prayers and hopes or something in her direction, how powerless she had been, though, that she had been a young girl, and that this, way younger than I had understood as a child, right? Now, as a child, nobody tells you that Mary was a child, that Mary was 14. She wasn't, she's always shown as like an adult woman, but she was a girl, and had like one of the most difficult sort of experiences I could imagine, God telling you what you're going to do, basically, and of course you're going to do it. And so I just started thinking about Mary as a woman, and Mary as a girl, and Mary's body, and the things that we don't choose. And so that's kind of how the book started developing, was when I understood that I was writing poems that would become a book, and trying to understand then my relationship to Mary, and then Mary's relationship to me and to women, and my relationship to women. So I guess it's a very long answer.
One of the things I noticed when I was reading the book, and I wrote you about this, was there's this tension between like the honor of being chosen and how that sort of takes away choice for the way that you've sort of drawn in the book, which I found really interesting. I also found that there was a surprising amount of overlap between our books.
Yeah.
Even though I have not been through the situation you're describing, just this idea of trying to figure out like the boundaries of one's own body, especially as a woman, and like trying to figure out like how you come into your own, and where the line between like what's expected of you and what isn't, where that line is, and all that stuff. So I thought it was really surprising that even though topically our books are pretty different, there's like a ton of overlap.
Oh, absolutely. And I think the, danger and the body is so like present in both of our books, and how we're engaging as people in female bodies, like looking out at danger and looking inward at danger, and, the ways that we can be harmed and the ways that harm can be done to us. I think that it's really interesting to me. And certainly, I love your book, and I'm really interested in there's sort of like these phantoms, or like the things that could have been but weren't, and things that were that we don't talk about. And I think that those are definite parallels, even though the specifics maybe are different, but they're rooted in the body, and I think they're rooted in femaleness.
In the life of the imagination, because one of the things I found, and I think about this with your work too, Jane, is that so much of a story is, so much time in any story that happens, or anything that happens, is spent with reflection or anticipation, worry, fear, desire, all those things that occur in the mind, and they're not necessarily rendered in plot points, or they're not, they're not actualized in that way. But yeah, I mean, I have several poems, as you know, in the book about miscarriage, for example. So it seems strange to have poems about something that to a certain degree never was, but they existed in the imagination, or, to a certain degree physically, etc. But yeah, I think that's interesting, that idea of sort of the intersection between like the concrete and the imagination. That's something that feels really important to all writing.
Yeah, I was going to say, because I felt so much in your poems, that there's like a lot of them carry a sense of foreboding, of things that will happen but have not yet, or things that could happen. And then there's other poems that of course are like looking back on things, or imagining, sort of like, this is what was happening that I wasn't there to witness necessarily, but I know. And I was so interested in this, like the distance, of away from things. It's not that, like, some of these poems are not happening in medias res, right? Like they're happening at a distance a little bit. But there's also like the catastrophe is not there, but it's coming close, either like from the past, or it's like approaching, we are approaching it, or it's approaching us from the future. And I was really interested in that, like this, like the positionality of the speaker in your poems and where they are in relation to catastrophe. Like, is it in the mind, or is it later in a continuum of time, or physical distance, I guess. So that was something fascinating to me.
Yeah, if I ever got like a neck tattoo, it would be vague menace. I feel like that's so much. I don't plan to get a neck tattoo, and certainly not that one. But vague menace. I joke sometimes that, every poem of mine is driven by vague menace. It's like, I know it's out there. I don't know what it is. Even when I know what it is, like the loss of a child or something like that, even when I know what it is, I feel like there's layers behind it that I'm obligated to identify or to perceive. And the menace is like not trying to figure that out, the danger. And I know in one poem, last week I was visiting a class, and college students were asking me about this certain part of a poem called What We Should Really Be Afraid Of, which
Yes.
is online, Missouri Review. And there's this list. I mentioned that I sort of jokingly mentioned that I started writing the poem in the winter of 2015, when everyone was complaining about the snow in New England, but really across the country. You remember that year well, I'm sure.
Apocalypse, yep.
I was so sick of hearing everyone complain about the snow. I was like, there is real stuff to be concerned about and afraid of. It's not shoveling. And so I started writing this poem as a joke, like listing all the things we shouldn't really be that afraid of, like, snow and bees and all these other things. And then I sort of painted myself into a corner with the poem, because I was like, well, what should we be afraid of? Because I can't just dismantle and mock and not offer something. And then I found that for me, at least, and I think this comes up again and again in the book, and as you pointed out, Leila, it's sort of that idea of the ways in which, like, we deceive ourselves, or we, especially as women, like, talk ourselves and each other out of things that we know. That I find to be the vague menace behind of those things. But
yeah, would you, because I have written, I'm like smiling at my paper because I have written fear circled many times versus fearlessness, and something in your collection is like danger is ever present. I mean, it's like literally even the word danger appears multiple times, and there is like a boldness. I'm thinking especially like in the first section that the speaker has like a real sort of boldness in the face of danger, and then this sort of dangers, I feel like, almost accumulate to a point where the speaker is more fearful. And so I was kind of interested in your relationship, I guess, when writing this book, to thinking about fear and how that developed for you, and maybe, I don't know, like, yeah, how you were thinking about that while you were creating these poems.
Well, so I didn't think of the book as a book at all. And in fact, I hadn't really written much, to be honest, after I finished my MFA like 100 years ago. But I'd been teaching, and eventually once I had my daughter, by some strange like hiccup in the world, that's when I started being productive. I mean, it was the busiest time, but I don't know, it was just a fertile time, I guess. And I started writing some poems, just isolated ones, and I just sort of put them in a drawer, and I didn't know what I would do with them. And I started meeting with some other poets eventually, and that sort of turned into the book. But I think, to your point about how sort of fear, there's an arc of fear in the book. When I organized it, I think I was thinking in the first section of like, there's something out there. What is it? We need to be on guard. And then as the book progresses, of a speaker or a single, point of view, trying to identify what it is and what to do. I think that that's probably one of the arcs. And I know we had mentioned before one of the poems, I'll just read if you,
Yes,
you had mentioned the one, Ways to Describe a Death Inside Your Own Living Body, which is not a cheery title. But this is, I have a poem called Miscarriage, and I was very lucky to have it in Best American Poetry. I was really happy about that. It's a very quiet poem. This is like the angry twin of that poem, where it's not as so much a quiet, sad poem. It's a little bit more of an angry poem. And it was a reaction to an experience many people have had, which is with Miscarriage, having people say, well, it happens all the time, and it wasn't really, a child yet, and stuff like that. And I wrote it years after. But anyhow, I'll just read this one. And I think there is some sympathy between this one and the Portrait of Mary in the waiting room that you read. Ways to describe a death inside your own living body. If wavy glass feels old to you, then sit down. I'm speaking from inside the lead curve, where black minerals burn to a shine like pissed off soot suns. I was sure it was a boy. I thought I knew the sound of darkness, the slow leather collapse of a bat's wing folding into itself, the swollen fucking of a cloud of them wrestling for space on the cave's drapery. Let's call it what it is, because that's how death begins, by tricking your body into an arch, as if life will just tie a string to your spine and hang there, a patient pendulum bob, waiting for you to finish. No. Inside the glass, we see death clearly. First, you feel limbs, which people remind you only ever imagined. Then vague flinting in the damp, then the suck of wet bread separating from its crust, then the white gloves around you flip inside out and move on with the bright day. Then you are far away. The deep cave you visited once, hollow, the planet's stone core, as it tries to carve out one secret place and fails. You wait for a soft mouse above to spill out of its hole, for the bats under your ribs to flap towards some smaller pulse, for the sun to give in as it does, so that the last headlamp can finally click off and head back into the night everybody knows. Interestingly, with that poem, I have had some people ask me about, well, I've had people refer to it as a medical procedure or medical exam, which I think is sort of interesting. But I think I've had some people ask about, oh, like, is it a miscarriage? Is it an abortion? Like, there's been some just small noise about trying to delineate how maybe people should emotionally connect to that poem. And I tried to develop the poem in a way that would render a certain moment, regardless of circumstances or what brought a woman there. And so I think that there's some maybe useful, I hope, ambiguity to the end of that poem and sort of like, what the circumstances are. That's something feeling in terms of solidarity.
We have a comment from Donna, who's said, having written about infertility and miscarriage, I'm so pleased that your books, which excavate experiences of the body, are in the world. Do you find that the world is more open to receiving these poems now? Or do you still find that there are obstacles to finding publication for poems about the body, especially those of the female identified body? And that speaks to what you were saying earlier, Leila, about, you being told that writing about your illness wasn't important.
Yeah, that question is a great question. And it's, really, because these early messages about, I was writing about my uterine tumor, and I was writing about the bleeding it caused me, and I was writing about infertility. And I'd been told that, explicitly, a man had told me, feminism's over, like women have already talked about this and you need to move on to a new subject. And I was like, well, how can it be over? I'm doing this right now. I'm living this. I don't know. So I was mortified. I was like a, young student, and I had really internalized that if I wanted to be taken seriously as a writer, I couldn't write about these things, that this was like, that would, it'd be the equivalent of me like smearing menstrual blood on the wall or something, that this was like, I don't know, some sort of like vulgar act. So, and he, had said that editors would not want to read these poems because they had blood in them, I guess. But, and I almost, when I had been told by a female mentor that had seen the beginnings of this book, like a sheaf of like 10, 15 poems or so, And I thought I was going to write a chapbook, and she was the one who said, no, that's your book. And I was devastated. I was really devastated because I thought, if this is my book, I won't have a career, because my first book needs to, I bought into this myth of the first book needs to be very important. And so to have an important book, you have to have a universal subject. And I was like, what could be less universal in my 25-year-old brain than, being Arab and Muslim, and I have this very weird tumor and it causes this thing. I was like, women don't like to talk about what their bodies are doing, and men certainly don't want to hear about it. So I was like, who am I talking to? Who am I writing to? Who's going to listen to me? And I told myself, I made this pact that I said, okay, I'm going to send out a couple of these poems to just like 5 journals. And if any of them show interest, then maybe I'll keep writing this. And if nobody does, then I'll shelve it, and that's it. And I'm done. And luckily, the first poem that had gotten taken was Confession, which is the first poem in the collection, and it won the Plowshares Prize, with a really kind note from an older female poet who I respected a lot. And that note and that publication gave me permission, I felt, to pursue this project. I felt like it was acknowledging that I was a serious poet and this was a serious subject worth investigating. And I am very happy to report that, my teacher, the man was wrong. Like, I've had such wonderful experiences publishing, poems about all sorts of hyper feminine subjects and the body. A lot of male editors. My editor at Copper Canyon is a man, and he is wonderful. And I've had so much support because I think, even though my specific illness was fairly gendered, we're all in bodies that mess up, and we all have, these fears of our mortality. I think many of us grapple with faith, which is a big part of my book too, is trying to understand my relationship to God. And so those things are universal, even if the specific was not. So I do think that people are open, much more open than I had ever anticipated, to talking about these things. I don't know, I've actually, knock on wood, have not had a negative experience. No one's thrown me out for reading a couple of uterus poems. So it's been good.
Allie, you said the poem that you just read about Miscarriage, did you say that was in Best American Poetry?
The one that I just read was in American Poetry Review, but the one of the early poems in the book, and the first poem I wrote after a long hiatus, that I, by the way, didn't consider a poem. I thought it was like a diary entry, was called, and that's the one that was in Best American Poetry. And shout out to the guys. My husband, who's a fiction writer, and he was like, you know what, I think this is really good. And I was like, you know what, this isn't even really a poem. Like, it's me being sad with some line breaks. And he was like, no, I think this is good. He wasn't like, you should do anything with it. I put it in a drawer, and a few years later, when I started to write more seriously, that was the first poem I sent out for attempted publication. And interestingly, I think, if memory serves, it got considered but rejected by a women's magazine. And then it was taken at Southwest Review by Willard Spiegelman. So again, a guy who, and he said he was outgoing at the time as poetry editor. And he wrote me a note and said, I'm outgoing and I don't want to create a big queue for the incoming editor, but I can't resist. And that meant so much to me, because I thought, this little non-poem, about my sad, and it's not just about a miscarriage, it's about vacuuming the carpet. So it's like really, entrenched. So like Leila, I think if anything was going to hold me back from writing poems about the body and about, being a woman, it was me. It was me, and other noise I've, sort of seeped in a long time ago. Mm-hmm. I feel like people have been really receptive.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel very surprised and lucky all the time, I guess, that we're able to have these conversations, because when I was growing up, and which was not that long ago, but like, I wasn't talking about these things. Like, a lot of my book deals with shame, and the shame of talking about the body directly, because I had been raised not to, one of the things that really opened up for me was as like a college student encountering the work of Sharon Olds, and realizing like, oh, you can write about a miscarriage, you can write about your period, you can write about the first time you've had sex. Like, I didn't know that was acceptable topics for conversation, let alone for like immortalizing in writing. And it was really that there's a lot of work that paved the way for this, but I have felt so lucky.
I will say, now that we're talking about this, I will say once, and I won't name names, of course, but one time I had a poem, let's just say taken. And after it was taken, one of the editors wrote me a message and said, can you email me at my private email address? I have some questions about the poem. And I gave pushback and twice was like, let's keep it on the regular.
Yeah, that's such a weird question.
Yeah, I know. And then proceeded to forward correspondence between himself and one of the other graduate student poetry editors, in which he asked a bunch of questions literally about, he used the term the girl stuff in the poem.
No.
And proceeded to ask me, what does this mean? What does that mean? I had a reference to ombre,
Yeah.
ombre, like hair and like piercing the cartilage, and I forget a few other things. And he asked me to demystify everything, which I did. But I thought, that's not cool, because since I was like 12, I've been looking up in dictionaries or encyclopedias what like it means when this character loses certain facilities in the war, and this character
Right.
way outside of the zone of a young female. So there's still some of it, but I had to laugh at the time because I think it was really rare.
Mm-hmm. I think that it is interesting to me because I've been told, or that word has been in the air or something, right? That these subjects of our female bodies are like too specific to be interesting. But I think the comparison to men's bodies in war, like men have been writing about war since the beginning of time, it feels like, and I don't know. So I think that's so interesting. Where it's like,
and men have been writing about women's bodies.
Yeah, that's true.
So I hope that women can write about women's bodies too.
Right. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Well, there's one other question I'll throw in. I'll let you guys get back to your regularly scheduled questions, but we have what is the name? E.M. Chaffa. I don't know who that is. But E.M. Chaffa says, both of you have a remarkable way of approaching the inexpressible. Though you write about specific topics, there's so much openness. There's always possibility in your works and creation within the loss. Apart from that, when you've written books that are so deeply personal and expansive, how do you feel? How has it changed your writing?
Oh, that's a great question.
You know what, Leila, I want to mention a line from you that I wrote down, because I know we were talking about a line from your book that I would like to shout out in response to this.
Sure.
Is I know we were talking about maybe discussing metaphor and how useful metaphor is in trying to get detailed and precise about certain things, but also how dangerous, because in establishing an equivalency, one risks being reductive. At least that's sort of my take on it. But I love this line from one of your poems when getting some news about sort of like physical, the image of a physical ailment. The speaker says, "God forgive me, I think mulberries." And so anyhow, I just wanted to shout out that line because I think there is this way in which there's a tension between like trying to be literal and to sort of honor the physicality of something, but also then thinking about comparison and representation. So anyhow, I wanted to mention that, but how would you respond to that question?
Yeah, I think it's so interesting to think about, what does metaphor do? And like, what is the point of metaphor? I think when I read as a teacher and things, sometimes I'll read metaphors that seem to want to obscure a thing or like put distance between oneself and the thing they're talking about. Like if I say it's this thing, then it moves it farther away from me into a place where I can look at it more clearly or maybe feel less, impacted by it. Like I'm creating an object, it's like some sort of sorcery or something, or transfiguration. But sometimes metaphor, I think, brings something very close. It's, a metaphor can also make something so clear that it takes something that's, maybe hasn't been lived, or something that's, a more theoretical concern, and it makes it like right before you, bodied, visible. And I really wanted in the book to say things plain as much as possible. I wanted to, my metaphors, I think, to not to beautify the thing and not to hide the thing, but to make clearer the thing. Because so much of what I was experiencing, right, even with the doctors, would be trying to explain something that was happening to my body that they couldn't, mostly men doctors, couldn't understand or believe. And so I'd have to really compare, like I'd be like, oh, how much blood? It's about this much, right? Which is a kind of metaphor. It's like if it were, you'd fill it this way and it looks like this and it does this. So like the language of my illness was so rooted in metaphor. Even the ways the doctor would communicate with me was always in metaphor. The tumor is the size of a golf ball. We use the fetal, growth chart to track my tumor. And so, I would learn, okay, this week it's an avocado and next week it's, it's grown to a grapefruit. And so like, it was always, my understanding of my illness was through metaphor because I couldn't see inside what was happening. And so my only way to understand like the seriousness of what was happening and its impact was to try and approximate with things I could see and I could touch and I could feel. But then, with the poet brain, I don't know if you get this too, right? When like, I feel like sometimes I'll be in the middle of something very serious, like in the poem, that you reference, that's, literally at the emergency room, the first sort of instance of me understanding that something is very wrong. And I really did have that thought. It's like my brain can't turn off the like image making. And sometimes it's like, this isn't appropriate, brain. Like, something serious is happening here. Like, stop making something out of what it isn't. Like, it is blood and it is bad, and it's not.
But I also feel like so much truth comes from that act of comparison. Like it is not necessarily completely transferring one thing to another in order to make meaning, but in finding the weird overlap is like where the truth lies. And I know we've been talking a lot about, women's bodies and those elements. I know like in the clearing, I have a bunch of poems about place, Gettysburg, Silverton, Colorado, very, very different places, but also places that used to have a significance that are hollowed out. I found that like that process that you were describing, like unexpected associations or that sort of trickle in, I found like I was trying to embrace those. Mm-hmm. The question asked about possibility, I think that is often the possibility, which is like, what is the relationship between these two unexpected things, and what can that tell us about like what could happen, or where there could be correspondence, or there could be beauty, for example, like in the example with the mulberries.
Yeah, I think it can make horror or fear, these kind of things that we're writing about, more real, right? Because it's like if the thing is shadowy, you talk about, this, the menace, right? The menace that you can't see. But if you can see it, it makes it more real. And it can be something. There are points too where I was sort of like struck by the beauty and horror both of like what the body could do. There, maybe this is gross, I guess, like I don't know if it's trigger warning or something, but at my surgery, they lifted my womb up out of me, and there's a photo. The doctor showed me a photo. I own this. I used to show it at parties, which is also really weird. But there was like this photo, and I was just so struck by like how beautiful it was. Like it was clearly gross and weird, but I was just fascinated by this image of my body open and there being like a hole, like a cartoon hole you'd see, and I don't know, a Bugs Bunny or something. And then my womb there, it really did look like a pomegranate, and just sort of like so stunned that like the body can be made multiple by the things it's like it's like, oh, look at all these things that it is and it isn't. I don't know, like it really shaped the way I saw things, because suddenly my body was doing all these things that were horrifying, but also like if I was an alien and didn't know what it was, I would think it was beautiful. It was beautiful. So I don't know, like I think that metaphor can help bring those closer to each other, whereas just sometimes the term itself doesn't do all that work because we have certain connotations with certain things. And so if you bring in another thing that has other associations, like fruit is beautiful, mulberries and pomegranates are lovely, and you merge them, I think it adds like this texture or something, friction that is that deepens it, I guess, that deepens the image.
Funny, we had Amy Bender on last Friday, and a lot of her work, her fiction, has to do with the relationship between unlike objects or unlike things, and the way that there is this sort of like electricity between them, and how a meaning is created between them. And she was saying that that's often where there's a tension between two unlike things is where she often finds inspiration. So that reminds me a lot of what
I love that.
you know.
Yeah, it's like the association, like there's a between world that happens when you bring two things and you try and say, okay, how are they similar? Then all of a sudden the brain is doing all this interesting stuff,
Right.
you know?
Yeah.
And I was thinking actually of Miscarriage, like there's that image, right, of the women on the rug. And that to me was very striking. I was thinking a lot about, like, I was thinking of metaphors, right? Like my brain immediately leapt to metaphor, right? And I think it's so interesting to learn that you thought of this as being like a diary fragment, because for me, I was like, oh, it's like ripe with metaphor. All these women are passing something along to each other. And yeah, I guess like, how did you think about metaphor? Especially, I guess, like in some of those extremely like bodied poems.
I mean, so much of what I would say echoes what you've said. I think, again, to me, the unlikely comparison, I mean, let me back up for a second. You know, people always ask prose writers, poets, how much of this is true? Well, they often just assume everything is 100% autobiographical, but I think any writer knows how you have a relationship to your narrator that's really intimate, but then isn't completely the same. Like there's that weird quality of like flying above and observing something, even as you very, in a hyper real way, experience it. I think of metaphor in this way too, which is if I'm really, really in something, or if I'm touching a texture and I need to figure out how to understand it more deeply than that, then I go out in order to get that new perspective and to say, kind of like, how can I shock myself back into like reintroducing myself to this thing I think I know well. So one of the ones toward the end of the book, there's a poem called Bear Fight in Rockaway. It's also online on Boston Review. And this was a really important poem for me because it put into words something that I'd felt for a long time, which is not a new idea, but the idea of the line between civilization and wilderness being very, very thin. And basically, two bears were fighting in a front yard in Rockaway, New Jersey. And people, like, it was trash day. People were getting their trash cans and driving by in their Saabs or whatever they were. And it was so crazy to me that there was this like wild, wild experience. And yeah, when listening again and again to the video, I really wanted to render the sound that the bears make as they're kind of confronting each other. And I listened to it again and again and again. And I thought, well, I could say the typical growl, you know, whatever, but it didn't sound like that. And there also was something about the quality of it being filmed that I wanted to capture. So I tried a million things and eventually settled on this little term, which I joke is like the only good thing I've ever written. This little term for it, digital mooing, because it sounded, when I really closed my eyes and I thought, what does it sound like to me from my catalog of experiences? It sounded like cows. It sounded like mooing, but like a shaky mooing. So, you know, that's the kind of thing that I was trying to, you know, do to play with metaphor in order to get closer to an idea.
I think that could also be like a Radiohead album, digital mooing.
Digital mooing.
I think I already ordered that. So
You guys stole it from them.
Yeah. So guys, unfortunately, we have to wrap up. This has been just fantastic, though. It's a pleasure hearing you guys talk, and I know our watchers have been enjoying it as well. So I want to make sure that everyone out there knows where they can get your books. We'll post links to bookshop.org. You can get them through the Mighty Blaze area on bookshop.org. And of course, any of your local independent bookstores can get them in stock if they don't have them already. And for Bostonians, there are signed copies of Allie's book there at the Trident bookstore right on Newbury Street, beloved old institution. I'm glad it's still there. I'm glad your book is still there. Yeah. So, thank you both so much. We really appreciate having you here and being our inaugural poets. So hopefully we can bring more poets on in the future. So
Thank you so much. Thank you.
It's great
Thank
having
you.
you. All right.
Thank you.
So long, everybody. See you later.